thanks to everybody who's involved in putting this meeting together, especially Mishka and all of the sponsors that were mentioned earlier, and King's University College. My name's Saul. I'm the Executive Director of Climate Action Network Canada. I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. I was asked to give some opening remarks over the next 5 minutes about how it was that I came to the climate change issue and began to see it as a moral and ethical challenge, and maybe lay a little bit of a foundation for what some of Climate Action Network and the climate community's overall strategic focus and priorities are. I'll then come back after the break and talk a little bit more about how I perceive the question of climate change from a moral dimension, and hopefully have some time to talk a little bit about how some of those issues play themselves out in practice in Canada on a day-to-day basis. I was born in Tanzania. I'm not Tanzanian. It was a bit of an accident of history. But I did always have that in my roots growing up, and managed to get back there a couple times as I was growing up, and ended up working in Mozambique for about 5 years in the early to late 1990s. And there were two things about Africa that I think have informed my vision or my perspective on climate change. The first is the Serengeti Plains, and this is where I went when Mishka asked his question. This incredible act of creation with the biggest example of megafauna in the world, elephants and zebras and lions mixing together with hundreds of thousands of gazelle and migrating wildebeest. It is just something that you look upon and you can't help but just feeling the most incredible sense of awe in terms of this world that I've ever seen. So if I had a chance to fight to protect something, I think that's where I might have gone. The second thing is, it's difficult to work in Africa for very long without realizing a very troubling pattern, a deeply troubling pattern whereby Africa has, over the course of 500 years, basically been subjected to a series of cruelties perpetrated by a relatively small portion of humanity again and again and again. And that's not to say that Africa doesn't play a role in its own in building its own future and in its own past. But I think it's difficult to look at the process of slavery or the colonial experience without feeling a great sense of injustice in terms of the way in which Europe and other parts of the world have played an active role in underdeveloping Africa, and in many ways traumatizing it. And that continues. But as I began to piece together my interest in the very extreme poverty that existed in Africa, and the sense of outrage that there were communities in Mozambique where 45% of children died before the age of 5, and the #1 cause of death was diarrhea, and pieced it together with this broader historical narrative about the role that the rest of the world has played in often helping, but sometimes and all too often traumatizing the people of Africa, I began to piece together the role that the environment is now playing as kind of the next phase in that 500-year narrative. And the idea that once again we had a problem which consisted of a relatively small portion of humanity, the richest portion of humanity, that had put about 80% of the greenhouse gas pollution in the air that's currently causing climate change. And yet it was going to be another portion of humanity, the poorest portion of humanity, the portion least responsible for the problem, that was going to suffer the consequences first and worst. And that struck me as an injustice in a very profound way. And so that has really informed, and where I come from since then, I've also been looking at the intergenerational question: what's our responsibility to children and future generations? I look at the question of species extinction and what's our responsibility to creation as a whole. But that frame has really dictated how I've approached this issue over the years. Climate Action Network is in some ways a reflection of that, in the sense that it is really a coming together of organizations from across the spectrum of communities who share a common sense of urgency around this issue. As Mishka pointed out, it's about 50 organizations and includes most of the key environmental organizations working on climate policy in Canada. But then it also includes constituencies that are absolutely essential to this issue, including youth groups, the Canadian Youth Climate Coalition and Sierra Youth Coalition, the United Church of Canada and Kairos, a federation of 11 churches and church organizations, are both represented on our board of directors, and the faith community has always played a strong role in the network. Indigenous peoples, the Assembly of First Nations is represented, labor organizations, the Canadian Labour Congress and the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and increasingly international development organizations such as Oxfam and the Canadian Council for International Cooperation are playing an active role within the network, and we're cooperating actively in the run-up to next year's G8 and G20 meetings with an even broader range of folks, including Doug Blackburn at World Vision. So I might stop there. I'm going to come back after the break and give a little bit of background on how I see this playing out as a moral and ethical issue, what I consider to be some of the core dimensions of it, and then some of the concrete questions that we face if we are prepared to look at it from that perspective. I think I'll end on perhaps not a particularly optimistic note, even though I think that we do ultimately need to see this as an opportunity, and there is a great sense of hope and opportunity in terms of achieving quite an important transformation over the next 10 years or so. But we find ourselves right now in a situation where, objectively speaking, we have a government that is unfortunately one of the worst actors in the world on this particular issue. And last night I went through a wide variety of indices in terms of different ways of calculating that. But without putting aside the partisan nature of it entirely, it's pretty much an objective reality that if there were a handful of countries that would be perceived as either not doing their fair share or actively blocking progress at the global level, Canada would almost invariably fall into that group if you were to do a survey of people outside the country. And so we have a real challenge around this issue, and I think we're up to it, and I think that this is a great country, and we were able to rise to that challenge. But that is unfortunately the context we find ourselves in today.